Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming along to the January 2025 Castle Studies Group online talk. We are very lucky to be hearing about Sleaford Castle today. We've been joined by Mark Bamford, who is the chair of the Sleaford Museum Council. He's been involved in the ongoing investigations at Sleaford Castle. And so I'm very interested to hear more about this, and no doubt you are all as well. So with that amount of background, I'm now going to hand over to our speaker. Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. I hope everybody can hear me okay.
Going through loud and clear.
Yeah, good. I'm delighted to be able to speak to you about a subject which has become very close to my heart in the last 5 years or so. First of all, I just want to give a little bit of a health warning. This is not going to be an academic treatise. The talk I'm going to present to you this evening has been generated for a general audience, and you will not be the first people to have heard it. It's also been generated, I guess, for people local to Sleaford in Lincolnshire. So at some stages during the talk, I think I might have to give you some geographical references for those of you that are not familiar with the breadbasket of England, as we are known. And that comment about the breadbasket of England is relevant to something I'm going to say a little bit later on. It's not perhaps a well-known castle, and one of the reasons is that there is not very much to see above the ground anymore. But that doesn't stop it from having a rather fascinating story. It stood witness to the events in England for about 450 years. And what I'm going to do this evening is tell you a little bit about the castle, its builder and its keepers, and the things it saw, and a little bit about its rather sad demise. Let's just set the scene if we can. You'll be, I hope, familiar with the idea of the Danelaw. So before the Norman conquest, Sleaford was a Saxon settlement, or shall I say Sleaford was a Saxon settlement within the Danelaw. If you're not sure where we are, then just about I'd say the A in Danish on that map is where Sleaford would be. It is, as it stands at the moment, just a market town. A little bit about its current status. It's got a population of around about 20,000, which is expanding. And of that 20,000 population, I reckon around about 5% knew even had a castle. So that's part of the mission that we have set ourselves. The overlord pre-Saxon, before Norman conquest, was Bardi, and he was reported to be the major landowner. His lands certainly would have included what is the site of Sleaford Castle. And one of the first things that we would love to be able to answer is whether Bardi, in fact, did have a stronghold in the current location. You'll be familiar with that kind of ladybird picture of a castle, and we do wonder whether, because the location is a bit problematic, whether that was the case. There's one person here who is very keen that this was the right idea, but a lot of my colleagues in and around Sleaford aren't so keen that I've got the right idea about it. But more about that a little bit later on. Bardi had the right to hold a market in the town, and that was granted by the Mercian kings. I'm calling it Saxon. Of course, it's probably more Angle than Saxon in terms of its mix of population here. But it was perhaps a site for royal justice and administration. It was a multiple estate. It was a forerunner of the Shire and Soak, and a central caput settlement. Which then brings us to the conquest. William the Conqueror, or the Bastard, confiscates the Saxon landholdings, including Bardi's. And the manor of Sleaford was given to Norman Remagus de Feecamp, and he became the Bishop of Dorchester in 1067. In 1072, the see moves from Dorchester to Lincoln, and the construction of Lincoln Cathedral begins. Now, I think it's probably true to say that the see was moved probably at the behest of William, because of the work he needed to do in order to suppress the uprisings in the north. I think perhaps it was William that persuaded the Bishop of Dorchester to move his see to Lincoln. But what he ended up with was an enormous see. As you can see, it was Lincolnshire, Leicestershire, Rutland, Northumberland, Huntingdonshire, Bedfordshire, Hertfordshire, Buckinghamshire, and Oxfordshire. It was absolutely vast. Let's have a look at what he got for his pains in Sleaford. Now, luckily, the Domesday Book does give us an indication. And the Domesday Book of 1086 tells us that he got 11 carucutes of land, part kept in Demesine by 3 ploughs, 29 villeins, and 6 soakmen. And this is the key thing. He got 8 watermills worth £10. And that's extremely valuable. We probably think that this is the largest holding of watermills, certainly in the east of England, and maybe even more extensively over wide than that. Just to give you an indication, another of the holdings of the bishop's holdings in Lincolnshire is Louth, and Louth had watermills, and they were worth 30 shillings. So that gives you some sort of indication. And there was 120 acres of meadow, 330 acres of marsh, an acre of coppice, and the total value was a nice round £25. So just to reiterate this idea about the watermills, that's obviously from that's from an illustration from the Luttrell Psalter. I always show that because, of course, above ground in Lincolnshire, we do have some very fine windmills. And people get a little bit tangled up with the idea that these might have been windmills. Now, of course, they weren't, because, as we know, windmills didn't come into England until later on in the 12th century. So it was these particular watermills. And the other thing that Bardi got was a very, very productive agricultural area. And somewhere was going to be needed, in actual fact, to store what the bishop was able to extract from the local population. And perhaps during this time, this barn, or the forerunner of it, was built on the edge of town, and it would need to be supervised. Remagus died in 1092, and in 1093, he was succeeded by Robert Blowett, but Robert Blowett died in 1123, which then brings us to our main man for this evening's discussion, which is Alexander Dubois, who was consecrated the Bishop of Lincoln on the 22nd of July, 1123. And he was known as Alexander the Magnificent, and that is not him in the picture. We have never found a picture of Alexander. So we don't know how magnificent he was, but we're suggesting he was pretty magnificent. Okay. So we've had a succession of bishops. Alexander was a member of a very important family. He was born around about 1090. His mother was Ada and his father was Humphrey, and he was the nephew of Roger of Salisbury, the Bishop of Salisbury and the Lord Chancellor to Henry I. Alexander was educated in Leon, and he served his uncle as archdeacon as early as 1121. He may have served as a royal chaplain, although he appears to have played no role in the administration of the kingdom before his appointment as Bishop of Lincoln. This appointment was surely influenced by his uncle, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle actually asserts that the appointment was done entirely for the love of Roger. So Roger will appear in our story again, but in this particular occasion, it's not Bob's your uncle, but Roger's your uncle. Alexander was known as the Magnificent, which is reflected in his ostentatious and luxurious lifestyle. But he did achieve an awful lot during his time as Bishop of Lincoln. And here are a list of his achievements, or some of his achievements. He added St. Albans Abbey to the diocese. He founded monasteries at Haverholme. It was that's local here to Sleaford. It's a Gilbertine. It was a Gilbertine house, and as you know, the Gilbertines are the only monastic order that was founded in England. A monastery at Dorchester-on-Thames, Louth Park and Thame. 13 Cistercian abbeys and 7 nunneries founded. the church at Markyate for the mystic Christina of Markyate and her nuns. She became a hermit or an anchoress at St. Albans. He founded a leper hospital in Newark. He was a regular presence at court. He attested royal charters, and he was the Royal Justice for Lincolnshire, and he built castles. He built castle at Newark, which we think was first completed around about 1133, Banbury in 1135, and Sleaford, we think, was begun around about 1130, completed in around about 1135, as I shall say later. This, of course, is not Sleaford Castle. Isn't it exciting if it was? This, of course, is Newark Castle, but it's described as being built in a florid style on a charming site amongst meadows washed by the River Trent. And the reason I show you this picture is because we are going to draw parallels between Newark Castle and Sleaford Castle. They were surely built around about the same time, and I would argue they were certainly built probably by the same team of masons that were responsible for each of the two castles. But why build a castle, I suppose, if you're a bishop? Well, we think probably Alexander, being a clever man, knew that something was going to be brewing in the kingdom, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So perhaps important men like bishops, who were holders of offices of state, needed to defend their position, lands and estates, against what they saw perhaps potentially as real and present dangers. Roger of Salisbury, of course, was Alexander's uncle, and he was a very gifted castle builder. Sherborne, Malmesbury, Devizes, and Old Sarum, just to name four, were certainly Roger's castles, and they certainly, we believe, inspired Alexander, his nephew, to build the castles that he did. Indeed, as I've said, we've now got a contemporary description of Newark Castle there. But let's have a look at Sherborne. This, of course, is one of Roger's castles. And one of the things that we like to do is we like to see if we can maybe draw parallels between the castle building of Roger and the castle building of Alexander. It might well have looked a little bit like that, although perhaps very much smaller and certainly more compact. And of course, Roger's castles, just like this one, built on the Celestial style, was very much a bishop's palace, as much as it was a defensive fortification. Indeed, we argue that Sleaford Castle was very much that, very much a bishop's palace, and very much an administrative centre to administer those watermills and the produce of those watermills, which was perhaps the major reason. Yeah, we think that the keep at Sleaford was probably not as big as Sherborne's, and probably smaller than Newark. But we reckon it took about 5 castle building seasons, 5 years, and we date its completion, although we have got no documentary evidence of this, to 1135. So let's have a look at where Sleaford Castle was built. It's a little bit problematic because it's not on the high ground. Okay, not all castles are built on the high ground. And again, this was not built for defensive purposes, but it's actually away from the medieval town. And I'll show you a map in a minute as to where it is in relation to that. It's on perhaps the lowest lying area of the fen that it could possibly be in. It's away from the main route. It's away from Mareham Lane. For those of you that are not familiar with the geography of Lincolnshire, Mareham Lane was a Neolithic trackway, an Iron Age trackway, and it later became a Roman road called King Street. And it was, if you like, an offshoot of Ermine Street. It was also distant from the major farming centre, which was Holdingham, which is another parish in the Sleaford, adjacent to Sleaford. And we argue that the castle was built for ceremonial and administrative purposes. This map is a map from my good friend Doug Plowman, and he puts the castle squarely here. I don't know if you can see my, I hope you can see my cursor arrow, but this is the location of Sleaford Castle. This is the location of Sleaford, and it is, as you can see, along, there is a ceremonial route that takes you from the center of the town. This is an Anglo-Saxon marketplace here, or this is where the marketplace is. This is the major church. I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. And this is the River Slee. So this is sat very firmly in the bottom of the valley of the River Slee. So the high ground is to the north, there's high ground to the south, and the castle is sat here in just about the wettest place that it could possibly be. And we think that that is probably one of the reasons why it is where it is. So let's have a look at a route to the castle, perhaps. This just gives you an indication of just how wet the area is. This is the water courses that we project for the time that the castle was built. There is a suggestion, and it's an idea, that this water course here, which is known in Sleaford as the 9 foot, was actually built in order to provide water for the castle, for the fish ponds and for the moat. But as I've said again, the route to the castle from the town was the usual medieval processional route that you would take. Okay, that is not what it looked like. That particular picture of Sleaford Castle was produced some time ago by a gentleman called David Taylor, and it was based on the best evidence at the time. It certainly is, the gatehouse certainly has got something to recommend it, but I will show you right at the very end, and you'll have to contain your excitement, but I'll show you right at the very end what we think it actually looked like. And I'll explain why we think that at the time. All right, we're pretty certain it had a garden. We would love to know exactly where it was in relation to the site of the castle. We've got a fair idea that it's actually on the potentially on the playing field of an adjacent girls' school, was where it might have been, but we can't conceive that Alexander, as the nephew, Alexander the Magnificent, as the nephew of Roger, would not have had a garden. And he certainly, of course, would have had orchards. And we'd like to know exactly where those were as well, but that is ongoing research. The castle was built, we believe, in that particular position to keep it away from the hoi polloi. He was Alexander the Magnificent. And in common with a lot of medieval castles, the route to the castle was designed to be as tortuous as possible. It was not designed to make it easy. It was not supposed to be easy. What you were supposed to do was you were supposed to, I believe, look at the castle in all its magnificence and all its awe. And this is our parish church. This is St. Denis, and this sits in the marketplace. And this is the west door. And I don't know if you think that looks like a French parish church, but it certainly does to me. This is St. Denis. It was named by Alexander. Alexander, of course, was a Norman. He was educated in Paris. He's educated in Lyon. And St. Denis is the patron saint of Paris. And we believe that St. Denis was Alexander's favorite saint, since that's why the dedication to this particular church. But when I do a walking tour, I always start people at the west door of St. Denis and walk them through the marketplace, along Westgate and down to Castle Causeway. It is not the most direct route to the castle, but it was designed, I believe, for shock and awe purposes. The actual Anglo-Saxon marketplace extended right through into Westgate. Westgate is a very wide thoroughfare in Sleaford, and one of the reasons perhaps for that was it was an extension of the marketplace. Castle Causeway, by the way, is a berm almost. We believe it actually was probably Anglo-Saxon in origin, and it was used to keep water, to store water. Yeah, you've guessed it, for those watermills, because that was what was on the River Slee. There are very few contemporary descriptions and no pictures of the castle exist. But Leyland, in his tour of England, arrived in Sleaford in 1544, and he describes it as having a high tower, perhaps of 70 feet. He says it wasn't set upon a hill, and he also says that it had an undercroft. So that's the description. That's the really only historical description that we have of Sleaford Castle. And as you can see, it doesn't give us a right lot to start with from a historical point of view. Okay. There has been limited digging on the site. This was done during the 19th century by a Victorian gentleman called Charles Kirk, who was very much Mr. Sleaford at the time in mid-Victorian times. He did manage to dig the castle. And in actual fact, David Taylor's drawing of the castle that I showed you earlier on is almost certainly based upon Charles Kirk's digging. But of course, you know what archaeology was like in the middle of the 19th century. Nothing like as detailed or as helpful as it is today. There has been some more digging. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on, but you all know it's blessedly difficult to get digging taking place because Sleaford Castle and the site of Sleaford Castle is a scheduled ancient monument. And as such, we have to do an awful lot of work in order to get permissions to dig. But there are plans to change that, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So I've told you that Sleaford Castle stood witness to a number of events during its 450 odd years of existence. I'm going to talk about a few of those now and tell you some of the stories associated. The one I'm going to go into, and I guess a little bit more detail than the others, is this one because it involves our hero, Alexander the Magnificent, who was the builder of Sleaford Castle. And this, of course, is where the trouble started. The trouble started for Alexander, and the trouble started for the kingdom on the 25th of November 1120, when Henry I lost his only son and heir, William, when a large vessel known to history as the White Ship foundered on its return to England from France. The story suggests that William and his retinue and all the crew were drunk and could not handle the ship in poor weather. Henry's other child was a daughter, Matilda, and without a legitimate male heir, Henry, even in his misery, demanded oaths of loyalty to her as the future monarch on his demise. Despite Henry's best efforts, he could never have another male heir. Reading a biography of Henry, or reading any biography of Henry, it didn't stop him from trying. But nonetheless, in terms of the legitimate male heir, that was not to be. And on at least 4 occasions, Henry made the barons, the magnates, and the bishops, of course, swear allegiance to Matilda on his demise. Before her father's death, of course, Matilda married the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V in 1114 and was thus ever known as the Empress Matilda. But the thing is, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a few Matildas knocking about. So I think it's perhaps worth just sorting a few of these out so we don't get our Matildas in a twist. First of all, there was Matilda of Ramsbury. Now, she was the mistress of Roger of Salisbury and the mother of his illegitimate child. Yes, as a Catholic bishop, yes, he did have a mistress, and she was called Matilda. Then there was Matilda, also known as Edith, who was the daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland, and she was the wife of Henry I and the mother to the Empress Matilda, who was the daughter of Henry I and the heiress to the English throne. And then there was Matilda of Boulogne, and she was the wife of Stephen de Blois, who became King Stephen of England, as we know. Okay, Stephen and Matilda. Matilda was in France when her father died in December 1135. That's coincident with the completion, of course, we believe, of Sleaford Castle. Interesting. And her cousin and Henry's nephew, Stephen, took his chance. He got back to England more rapidly and had himself crowned as king in Westminster Abbey on the 22nd of December, 1135. Most of Henry's court, including Roger of Salisbury, Alexander, and, I haven't mentioned him yet, but Alexander had a brother, and his brother was Nigel, and he just so happened to be the Bishop of Ely. So between the 3 bishops, you can see that they controlled a goodly part of England in terms of their ministrations. We believe that the 3 bishops at the time supported his coronation because I think perhaps they might have been relieved that they had a gentleman on the throne rather than a lady. and this was despite the fact that they had all sworn dying allegiance to Matilda before the old king's death. We know that relationships are fairly fluid in the 12th century. The early years of Stephen's reign, we know, were not settled. The borders of England were continually under pressure from Scotland and Wales, and to make matters worse, his inability to settle these border conflicts were seen as weakness by the barons within the kingdom, and revolt and insurrection broke out in many places in the country. In 1137, Stephen went to Normandy to deal with the threat from Matilda and her second husband, Geoffrey. Whilst he was away, trouble broke out on the Welsh border, and the Marcher lords were left trying to shore up the borders with some limited success. On his return, his support to them was somewhat half-hearted, and they became even more disillusioned with his leadership. They began to reconsider their allegiance. Insurrection and opposition really took hold in 1138, and Stephen had to firefight all over England. In 1139, Stephen's court assembled at Oxford, and a dispute broke out between Roger of Salisbury and Alan, Earl of Richmond, over accommodation. A skirmish ensued, and blood flowed, and there were fatalities, which led to Alan and the rest of his men fleeing for their lives. Stephen responded to this mayhem by ordering Roger and his nephews, Alexander and Nigel, to hand over all their castles to his custody. They refused, their castles were taken, and they were placed under arrest and stripped of their bishoprics. Prior to this, which is often seen as a gaffe by Stephen, the three had been his staunch, loyal supporters. It's thought that Stephen was goaded into doing this by some factions at his court who were jealous of the wealth and power held and exerted by the three bishops. They were also envious of the castles they held, which rivaled in size and splendour the greatest in the land. Again, this is a reference to something which gives us some clues about Sleaford Castle. Alexander was imprisoned in Oxford in conditions which medieval chroniclers described as bad, and I'll leave it to your imagination to know what that might have been. Nigel evaded capture, fled back to Devizes, which was one of his uncle's castles, and preferred to fight, only surrendering when Stephen threatened to hang his cousin Roger. Now that's the son of the Bishop of Salisbury. That's Roger's son, the son of Matilda of Ramsbury. So what about Sleaford Castle? Upon the arrest of Alexander, Sleaford and Newark castles refused to surrender, only doing so when Stephen threatened to starve Alexander and Roger to death. Both castles were given into the custody of Robert, Earl of Leicester, who had previously been in dispute of the ownership of additional estates in Lincolnshire and with Alexander, and he took full advantage of the situation. So this is the first time that Sleaford Castle doesn't belong effectively to the Bishop of Lincoln. It actually belongs to the Crown. And as we'll see on two further occasions, the only other time when the ownership of the castle moved from the Bishop of Lincoln was when the bishop took a political position which opposed the Crown. More of that a little bit later on. Stephen's brother, Henry of Blois, was the Bishop of Winchester, and he interceded on behalf of Roger and his clan by summoning Stephen to appear before a legatine court to answer for his actions. Now, the Bishop of Winchester, Henry, was also the papal legate, which made him the most so that he outranked all the other clerics in England. Instructive that Stephen readily submitted to his jurisdiction. We know the medieval view of the power of the church. So Alexander's released, and on return, he promptly excommunicated Earl Robert when he refused to hand over the castles. Alexander successfully appealed to the Pope, Innocent II, to recover the castles. From the moment that Stephen picked this fight with the church and these powerful bishops, his fortunes in England rapidly declined. This coincided with Matilda's invasion of England, and she landed with her forces in Bristol in September 1139. The majority of the bishops transferred their allegiance to her. All of her followers followed in no particular guiding principle apart from their loyalty to the oath that they had originally taken and reneged upon, to Henry, complete self-interest, as you might imagine. Stephen's lowest ebb was his defeat and capture at Lincoln in February 1141. Matilda is now the de facto ruler of England, but not for long. Alexander was present at Oxford in July 1141 when Empress Matilda held court in an attempt to consolidate her hold on England. Alexander spent much of his final years in Rome at the papal court. We believe his health had been severely dented by his period of very brutal captivity. But he finally returned to Lincoln in 1147. But all of his travels and travails really took the toll on his health, and he died in Lincoln in 1148. No tomb of his remains, but we are convinced he's buried in the cathedral somewhere. But many of his books, mostly biblical works, are in the cathedral library. And that is the finest cathedral in the kingdom, is it not? Okay, I can see some of you might not agree with me, but that, of course, is Lincoln Cathedral. Sleaford Castle passed into the ownership of Alexander's successor, who was one Robert de Chesney, and he was consecrated in December 1148. We need to finish, I guess, the story of the anarchy, which are probably most of you are familiar with, but the final years of the anarchy produced no clear rule. Although Stephen regained control after Matilda was defeated in London, her main aim became to promote the lineage of her son Henry, who was becoming even more powerful in Normandy. And Stephen died on October 1154 and was succeeded by Matilda's son, who became Henry II. Which I guess brings us to the next story, which was witnessed by Sleaford Castle. So did peace in England reign under Henry II? Yes, not so bad under Henry II, but then we got John. And only this comment, I think, foul as it is, hell itself is made fouler by the presence of John. So John is now in our story. King John is now in our story. Okay. Magna Carta was signed and sealed 17th of June 1215, probably quite willingly, as John certainly had no intention of being held to it. And so the trouble started, or perhaps more accurately restarted, and the medieval tussle for power between the English nobles and an English king began all over again. Let's fast forward now to September of the following year, and let's go to September 1216. In September 1216, French forces are besieging Windsor under the command of Prince Louis, son of Philip II of France. And he's supported by a large number of English barons and lords. John tries to lift the siege. He fails. Sorry, that's Magna Carta. There's Windsor Castle. He tries to lift the siege and fails. And so he runs away, cunningly drawing the invaders away, depending upon your view. So he's either run away or he's drawing them away, and he flees into East Anglia, and he goes from Sonning to Cambridge in 3 days. There's no doubt that John could certainly move. He was quite a horseman, and he certainly could move. So John moves through the eastern counties, burning and destroying the rebel barons' lands and holdings. Also, he would quite like to intercept Alexander, the King of the Scots, who'd been paying homage to Louis. Followed or chased, whichever way you care to look at it, by the French army as far as the border of Lincolnshire, burning crops and barns as he goes. He goes particularly towards the religious houses. As he advanced, he drove another rebel army towards Lincoln. He lifted the siege of Lincoln Castle, who was defended by the constable of the castle, who was one Nicola de la Haye. As some of you may or may not know, it was rather unusual for a lady to be the constable of a castle. In actual fact, the story goes that Nicola offered her resignation to John on the grounds that she was a woman, and John refused it. So perhaps John was a proto-feminist. I'm not quite so sure. I don't think so, really. But Nicola de la Haye was certainly responsible for the defence of Sleaford Castle, Lincoln Castle on a number of occasions. He then travelled along the Lincolnshire coast, burning as he went. The Crowland Chronicle tells us that never has there been a time when there was so much fire in the land. This brings us to the 9th of October 1216. John is 49. He's exhausted from constant campaigning. and he leaves Lincolnshire for King's Lynn, one of the most prosperous ports in England. What he's trying to do is he's trying to organise the resupply of his forces campaigning against the northern barons, because he wants to resupply them by sea, because he can't resupply them by land, because the route to the north is held by his opponents. John falls ill with dysentery, perhaps caused by an excessive intake of food and drink. He's known to be fond of peaches and new cider. On the 11th of October 1216, he sets off to return to Lincolnshire, and in his haste, against advice, his baggage train takes the shortcut across the treacherous tidal quicksands of the Wash. Right, now there's a ladybird picture for you with lots to argue about. All right. The first thing I would suggest is that John's not there when this happened. We believe that John took a southerly route via Spalding, and he sent his baggage train across the Wash. That's the first thing. Second thing, and he's wearing the crown, so that's not going to end up in the Wash, is it? However, modern thought is that the crown jewels were no longer in that baggage train, because they had long been broken up and used to pay for John's mercenary army that he needed in order to defend his realm. What he did lose, though, almost certainly, and this would have been most mortifying for him, were his holy relics. Ralph of Coggeshall describes them as lost all the precious items of his chapel. John sets off, and he arrives eventually at Swineshead Priory, and it's at Swineshead Priory that he's actually told about the loss of his baggage train. Now, he takes a turn for the worst. There is a story that goes that John didn't have dysentery, but John was actually poisoned by the monks at Swineshead Priory. The story goes that he was offered a peach, as I've said, one of his favourite foods, with toad slime smeared underneath the skin, and that is what actually caused him to become extremely unwell. When I do the work with children, that's the story I tell them because they like it. I'm not sure it's true. I think he had dysentery. On the 14th of October 1216, he arrives at Sleaford Castle, and he has already confiscated the Sleaford Castle, Newark Castle, from the Bishop of Lincoln, who's Hugh of Wells. And Hugh of Wells is actually in exile due to Pope Innocent III taking an interdict against John. Hugh of Wells takes obviously the side of the Pope. So once again, Hugh of Wells is taking issue with the crown. The Bishop of Lincoln takes issue with the crown, and Sleaford Castle, along with Newark and Banbury, is confiscated. He's also informed by a messenger that Lewis's forces have collapsed the main entrance to Dover Castle. The defenders sought a truce. Would John come to their aid, or should they surrender? John takes a turn for the even worse. He is bled, but surprise, surprise, to no avail. On the 15th of October, he's still at Sleaford, and he writes to the Pope, and he says, I suffer from a grave and incurable infirmity. On bended knee, I commit my kingdom to the church's protection. We believe that this is obviously to protect his son Henry's succession to the throne. On the 16th of October 1216, he sets off for Newark. That's, of course, he's also confiscated from Bishop Hugh. And he falls from his horse at a small village between Newark and Sleaford called Huff on the Hill, where there's a priory. But he's then taken the rest of the way to Newark Castle and is dragged behind a horse. On the 17th of October, he dictates his last will and testament and assigns administration of his affairs to a trustee such as William Marshall. But as we know, that William Marshall's conduct after this is a story for another day. On the night of the 18th of October, there's a tremendous storm which blows around Newark Castle and around the walls. Abbot Adam from Croxton, Croxton Abbey, by the way, is at a place called Croxton Kerrial, which is between Grantham and Melton Mowbray. He sends for Abbot Adam. Abbot Adam is known as a healer. Abbot Adam hears John's final confession and administers the last rites to King John. And King John dies on the night of the 18th of October. On the 19th of October, John's body is prepared for burial. His heart and intestines are removed and are given to Abbot Adam as a present, some present. And that's taken to Croxton Abbey. His body is embalmed and he is conveyed to Worcester Cathedral, where he is to this day. And that enormous marble slab, once again, I tell the children, is to make sure he doesn't get out. On the 28th of October 1216, Henry III is crowned at Gloucester. He's 9 years old. His mother, Isabella of Angoulême, provided a gold torque or circlet for the ceremony. Some people have taken that as evidence that the crown was in the wash. No, we don't think so. We think perhaps as a 9-year-old, the crown wouldn't have fitted anyway, so they would have needed something else to carry out the ceremony. Peace is going to reign now, isn't it? Not quite, okay? Because we have to deal with this chap here, Edward II. So we're fast forwarding now into the 14th century, and Edward II is on the throne. The castle changed hands briefly during the 14th century for what became known as the Despencer Wars. While still in the hands of the Bishop of Lincoln, England became embroiled in more civil conflict between King Edward II and the barons. You will probably know that Edward II was perhaps potentially swung both ways. And one of his favourites was Piers Gaveston, and another of his favourites later on was Hugh le Despencer. And his wife Isabella was known to be left rather alone, while Edward II spent more time with Piers Gaveston in the first instance before he was murdered, and then Hugh the Despencer. But the main thing is that once again the crown and the barons have fallen out. In 1120, at the direction of the king, the chapter of Lincoln Cathedral appointed Antonio Beck to replace John Dalderley as the Bishop of Lincoln. That was not confirmed. One of the opposing barons was the first Baron Baldemere, and he urges the Pope, John the 22nd, to appoint Henry Burgess as Bishop of Lincoln, and he was consecrated on the 20th of July, 1320. He was Baron Baldemere's nephew. So this time, Bart's your uncle. The rebelling barons, including Bartholomew, were defeated at Boroughbridge in 1322. And after the execution of the leading barons, Henry Burgess, as Bishop of Lincoln, had his lands and castle confiscated because he had taken the side of the barons. Sleaford Castle was once again not in the hands of the Bishop of Lincoln, but it was in the hands of Edward II for 4 years until 1326. He returned the estates of the Bishop of Lincoln on the assistance of the Pope, and he returned from exile. Sleaford Castle never really suffered any attack of any form apart from the people of Sleaford. In 1327, after the Bishop of Lincoln had got the castle back again, the good people of Sleaford broke in, stole documents, stole 60 of the bishop's horses, and stole 90 head of cattle. You can see that's quite a substantial agricultural holding for 1327. However, that rebellion was put down. In 1377, 30 burgage tenants attacked and smashed the pond mills, making the miller swear on oath that he would grind no one's corn but the men of Sleaford. They were arrested and accused of trying to disrupt the manor. So this is the castle's last hurrah. This is going to be our fourth king that we're going to talk about, and this time it's Henry VIII. You will probably know that there was an uprising in Lincolnshire in 1536. In 1536, the Lincolnshire Rising began at Louth, and this was due to the discontent by the new Church of England's attempt to affect the liturgy and doctrine and the worship of England. This was a precursor to the much more famous Pilgrimage of Grace, which came later that year and spread widely through northern England. But it would appear that by 1541, that in actual fact, Henry had forgiven Lincolnshire. Those comments are what Henry called us good Lincolnshire folk. You might be able to tell from my accent that I'm not a yellow belly, I'm actually Bristolian, but nonetheless I'm adopted Lincolnshire, and Lincolnshire folk were considered to be the rude commons of the most brute and beastly shires of the realm. Discontent spread through Lincolnshire and soon affected the townsfolk of Sleaford, who petitioned John, 1st Baron Hussey of Sleaford, Lord Hussey, to support the uprising. In brief, Hussey, whose fine estate house was at Old Place Sleaford, and that's a picture of same, was caught between a rock and a hard place. Did he go against the people of Sleaford and support King Henry, utilise his meagre resources to resist and then put down the uprising, or did he lead the people in the uprising? This is a really great story, but I'm sorry, that's for another day. In sum, Hussey does neither and is later implicated in the Pilgrimage of Grace. He's accused of treason, found guilty, in part by the waspish testimony of one Robert Carr, who's going to appear in our story a little bit later on, and he was executed at Lincoln in 1537. All his lands and properties were confiscated by the Crown. So once again, Sleaford Castle now hands up in the hands of the Crown. However, by the summer of 1541, as I've said, Henry appeared to have forgiven Lincolnshire and arrives in Sleaford from Grimsthorpe Castle on his way to Lincoln and York on the 8th of August. So this is Henry, and I don't think that's Catherine Howard. I think that's Catherine of Aragon. You might be able to help me with that, but I haven't been able to find a picture of Catherine Howard. And when I attended the exhibition in the National Portrait Gallery, there was only one small miniature of Catherine Howard. And even then, they weren't sure of the attribution. Anyway, Henry arrives at Sleaford. It must have been quite something because, of course, this is the royal progress to the north. We believe that King Henry stayed at Lincoln Castle. We think he did. By this time, it had been returned to the Bishop of Lincoln, so we think he might well have been the Bishop of Lincoln, but he might also have stayed in the manor house in Sleaford, which was in Northgate. So this gives us a little bit of a date when the castle, we believe, was still habitable, because we're getting towards the end of our story now. We've got no record of him being in the castle except on the morning of his arrival, which was August the 9th, 1541, when he held council at the castle before proceeding to Lincoln. He was accompanied by Catherine Howard, and it was perhaps the first time that she misbehaved was in Lincoln in the following times. On his return from the north, the king stayed at Sleaford again on the 14th of October, coming from Nocton the night before. On this occasion, he received an ambassador from the King of Portugal, who came to treat on the transport of corn from England to Portugal. Now we know that that meeting took place in the fading grandeur of what we believe is the bishop's receiving room on the second floor of Sleaford Castle. So 1541 gives us an evidential cut-off date for the existence of the castle. That's what we've got left. Impressive, huh? Yeah. That is all that remains above ground of Sleaford Castle. In August 1547, Henry Holbeach, the then Bishop of Lincoln, sold the manor of Sleaford to Edward Seymour, who was the first Duke of Somerset. And this did include the castle. He sold the manor and the castle back to the king, who was then Edward the Fourth in 1550. So the castle now passes into the hands of the fifth king. Robert Carr, who was a noted man in Sleaford, took a 21-year lease on most of Sleaford, but we don't think the castle, on the 17th of May, 1551. Now things become a little bit complicated. Whilst Robert Carr was a tenant, the manor was granted to Edward Clinton, the first Earl of Lincoln, in 1556. Robert Carr had most of Sleaford in the lease, but not the castle, and this only appears right at the end of the recital of the grant and our castle of Sleaforth, otherwise Sleaford. This perhaps shows that the castle was still valuable to the king and was therefore still standing, and a valuable building worth retaining by the king in 1556. However, there is some debate about who had title to the castle after this date. The Bishop of Lincoln still had some claim. Indeed, he may have removed the iron and the lead before, in effect allowing Robert Carr to begin to sell the stone for building work in the town. Sometimes people ask if they can see Sleaford Castle, and besides this very, very sad lump of masonry on the castle site, we do say that quite a lot of the buildings in the town might well have stone in it from the castle. The difficulty is, as you well know, dating stone is pretty difficult. We haven't found any stone in the town that's got mason's marks on it or anything like that, which are attributable. So that just remains a theory. So this is what remains. It is the corner of the northeast wall of the bailey of the castle. We don't think there's a very much below as well. As I say, only this is what's thought of this upturned portion. But it would indicate that the outer wall was some 5 feet thick. The Kirk archaeology and drawings of 1863 were written and described in a manner of mid-18th century techniques, and so tell us relatively little. So this pushes us back onto the archaeology, and also on the archaeology, which for the last 6 years has, largely speaking, had to be non-invasive. We start with that absolutely magnificent summer's day oblique picture of the castle site. You can see the outline of the castle very clearly there. The lump of masonry I've just shown you is there by that tree underneath that corner. But you can see there are still substantial earthworks, and here we have got what is the outline of the keep. That is the gatehouse. This is the berm, Castle Causeway I told you about, and this road here, which is Watergate, didn't exist in that time. So that's where we start, that lovely dry summer image that we have. If we look at the LiDAR does tend to confirm the outline. What's interesting, of course, is that the actual layer of the inner bailey wall that you can see there is not square. It's trapezoidal. And there is a question as to why that should be, why it was built in that trapezoidal form. Once again, you can see the keep in the center there. There is the gatehouse. If we combine the LiDAR with ground penetrating radar and then put an overlay on it, this is what we think the walls and lines of the castle were. And this structure here, is that barn I showed you at the very beginning. Yeah, and this structure here is possibly a dovecote, but I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Okay, and this structure here with that apse at the end, boy, would we love to know what that was, but it's still under the ground and we've got nowhere near it. So we did actually get permission to dig, but these are the 5 locations that we were allowed to dig in, and you can see that all of them are outside of the inner bailey wall and away from the keep. We were allowed to dig 5 scrapes, 2 meters long by 50 centimeters deep. That's it. That was what we were allowed to do. And consequently, as you can imagine, the finds were not terribly spectacular. In fact, all this perhaps did was confirm the dimensions and the structure of the barn. Those 2 digs are on the walls of the barn. And it opened a can of worms as to whether it's a dovecote or not, because the dig there tended to suggest that it wasn't necessarily a dovecote. That which has been considered to be a dovecote for all these years, perhaps maybe not. This dig here actually was outside, and so is that one there. These are actually outside, and that just actually revealed some tiled building material. Some of the finds that were found were quite interesting. Certainly tiles from these 2 locations showed that the barn itself was at one time tiled. In fact, there is a lovely story because 2 of the tiles that were recovered have paw prints on them, one of a dog and one of a cat. And we've had actually a children's book written by a local author in conjunction with local school children, telling the story of how the cat came to the castle to see the bishop. But it's rather good. The other thing we did find was, of course, some Roman coins. So that actually did cause a little bit of difficulty, and some Roman pottery as well. But then again, there's no other indication that this was a Roman site or even a Romano-British site, because Romano-British Sleaford is some distance away. So that was the dig. That was in July of last year. And that's what we think the castle looked like. Now, this is based, of course, upon a number of things. First of all, it's based upon the archaeology. It's based upon the very limited work that we've got in terms of history, written history. But the majority of it, of course, is based on comparison studies with Newark. That gatehouse there is pure Newark. Yeah. This keep is based, largely speaking, we think, on not so much on Newark, but more on Rogers keeps of Rogers castles. The watercourses, we have had some augering done. We still wait for the report on the augering of the watercourses. The direction of these watercourses is very problematic. This we don't think is moat. We're pretty certain it's actually a fish pond, because after all, we believe this to be a bishop's palace and an administrative centre for this enormous barn, which had the produce of all of those watermills, because all of the watermills remained in the ownership of the Bishop of Lincoln until the estate passed elsewhere. What else have we done? Well, we're about to take delivery of a 2mm to the foot scale model of that castle, which is been constructed, and that will be on display at the exhibition, which is in Sleaford, and it runs till the 31st of March. It is not in the museum. It is in Navigation House, which is another historic heritage site in Sleaford, in the middle of Sleaford. And the model will be there at that particular time. So what's the future? The Sleaford Castle Heritage Group, of which I am a member, wants to dig more. But it's, as you know, expensive, destructive, and would be difficult to obtain permissions. But we are gradually getting together some fairly tightly focused research questions, which we think might get us some traction with Historic England. The site actually belongs to Sleaford Town Council. So that's pretty good as well, because we obviously have some great support from them. We think we might be able to dig the Kirk trenches. These are the 19th century trenches, and we think it might be easier for us to obtain permission to redig the Kirk trenches. So that's a try. We'd like to further auger the watercourses this time to obtain samples for bioarchaeological analysis. That would give us some extra information. Now then, this has been achieved. We have written and produced new interpretation boards and the electronic visualization in the light of the new archaeology. The new interpretation boards have QR codes on them that enable people to scan them with their telephones and actually take a walk around the Great Barn and also a walk inside the inner bailey of the castle. Those interpretation boards have been produced. We now await the new pathway. We're going to put a new hard pathway around the castle site, which will allow wheelchair access, and that is when the interpretation boards will be properly mounted again, and they will tell the story that I've told you tonight, largely speaking, concentrating on Bishop Alexander, the visit of John, and the visit of Henry. A new bridge. Without boring you with the geography of Sleaford, at the moment there is only really one long route to the castle site. We want to try and make it a little bit shorter by putting a new bridge onto the site from a place called Nag's Head Passage, which is in fact a public footpath. There won't be so much trouble for that, because that will land on ground that has already been mauled to death when the railway arrived in Sleaford in 1857. And the better signage from Southgate and the museum is taking place as we speak. Some has gone in over the last couple of days. We are producing these signs. That's an example of one of our signs, which has obviously a little bit of a decode here. This is one of the signs about why building a castle in Sleaford, so I thought I'd show you that one. This has also got rather a nice picture. This is a Victorian picture, which actually was produced in 1857. It shows our parish church St Denis there. It shows the piece of rubble which we've got left, and it also shows a very fine Victorian flour and paper mill. So that's that. Sleaford Town Council, Sleaford District Civic Trust, North Kesteven District Council have been enormously supportive, and of course, Sleaford Museum, of course. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.